My name is Cindy Ott, and I'm an American Studies professor at St. Louis University, and I'm a Carson Fellow. The project I'm working on at the Rachel Carson Center is Biscuits and Buffalo, Squashing Myths About Food in Indian Country. And the basic question I ask is, what is Plains Indian food exactly? And as an environmental historian, I'm compelled to ask, what are the ways that they've produced, consumed food, and what that says about Indian sense of heritage and identity here in the 21st century. When most people think about Indian food, they think about corned beans and squash and buffalo. But if you go out to the reservation, where I've been the last 10 years, you don't find any of those foods in reservation households. So there's a disjuncture. So I'm curious about that disjuncture. So if corned beans and squash and buffalo is an Indian food, what is Indian food exactly? The reason I use food to look at Indian identity or for Indian communities is because it creates these interconnections for many aspects of life. So you can't understand people's appetite for food from any one perch alone. You need to look at the economic issues that structure their lives, environmental issues that structures their lives, so there's relationships between people and the plants and the animals that they're consuming. There's relationships among people, so strong sense of creating ethnic identity, gender identity, regional, national identity through foods. When we're eating the same foods, we create a sense of community. You connect with the workers that are producing the foods. And so when you look at foods, you see how culture and identity is created in all these various aspects and how they're interconnected with one another instead of just particularly focusing on economics or something like that. And so people create these interrelationships with the foods that they eat, and some of these things they control and some of them they can't. But none of these relationships are static. So people change what they eat, who they eat with as they move through time, and Indian people too. So I think it's a really good way to bust some of these stereotypes because it's a very dynamic and interdisciplinary or interrelational part of culture that brings so many aspects of culture together. So the story of Garden is one that turns the history of boarding school experience for Indians a bit on its head. So the traditional story is that Indians go into boarding schools and their culture is erased and they come out as white people. So I'm trying to change the perspective of that, respecting that it was a very traumatic experience for many people and many parents having their kids go off to these boarding schools. But there is also things that they got out of the boarding school experience that they found has been useful for their culture. So in the boarding schools, many learned to garden and had a can, and also from government representatives on the reservation. And now these traditions are used as a form of heritage and celebration. So these gardening traditions were learned in the boarding school experiences. People that went through these experiences became pivotal members of the Crow community, the Indians that I'm studying in particular. So they became political leaders, they became educators within the community, and strong and active gardeners. There was a big sense of who they were as in serving their communities and their families as these gardens. So it's example then where Crow Indians and Plains Indians, they use cultural traditions from non-Indians in ways that can support their communities and not just undermine it. And there's nothing particularly Indian about only relying on indigenous internal cultural traditions to maintain a sense of identity and heritage. Celebrating buffalo and celebrating women gathering plants is terrific. There's wonderful stories, and it's a deep part of the ceremonial traditions of this community, but it's just not the only story. And celebrating traditions from 300 years ago causes a cultural dissonance, and especially among young people, to think that the only thing that's valuable and that's really Indian is from 300 years ago, and that nothing within their contemporary lives. So in my project, I'm trying to draw attention to how people actually eat and the traditions that come of it in their real everyday lives, to draw attention to celebrating these recent generations of Indians instead of just those in the distant past.